So we are on sermon number 5 on the topic of worship. And I would submit that we cannot talk about worship without at some point understanding why we gather every week on Sunday in a place called church to sing songs, read the Bible, say prayers, hear sermons. If we're going to worship together, why does it matter which day? Over the years, I've had several friends who are shift workers. You ever tried to follow the schedule of a shift worker? It's all over the map, right? Or someone who's on call. These kinds of careers, they demand full attention, and often the employees find themselves scheduled across multiple weekends in a row. A persistent challenge for the church is to figure out how to accommodate these folks when you try to have a regular schedule, but their schedule is so irregular. The Alliance Church where I lived in Saskatchewan grew to a size where they needed to go to 2 services. And instead of 2 Sunday morning services, do you know what they did? Sunday morning and Saturday evening. And that's how they went. And they did that for the shift workers because then those people could attend one or the other service depending on when their shift fell that weekend. Alas, that's really difficult for a church to pull off. And essentially you need 2 full worship teams, one for the Saturday and one for the Sunday. So that came to a close in their church. But God admire their effort to include those who cannot make the regular time. But the exception proves the rule. Saturday evening service was a tough go because Sunday morning was still the main function. And this is my thesis today. Regular Sunday worship is all about patterns. God has built people to be attracted to patterns and to rely on habits. Not 100%, but everywhere you look, there are routines. Paychecks are distributed on some kind of regular pattern. And if that pattern is broken, people are pretty unhappy, right? Mortgage payments are due on a mandatory schedule. The school day has a series of bells to remind students that it's time for the next thing on their agenda. It's a pattern. Buses and airplanes run with precision timing. Husbands and wives have a date night regularly scheduled. Right? Okay. Might be a good pattern to begin if it's not already happening. In the Bible, we find the very first pattern that was mandated for humanity. It's the pattern, you know it, of 6 plus 1. 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th you shall rest. God set the example for the pattern. We're not accustomed to thinking about God as needing a rest exactly. I mean, he's all powerful. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He's all these things. Does he really need a rest? If he worked 6 days in creating the world, was he really worn out and tired and really needed to relax and put his feet up? Why did God, who is all powerful, need a whole day off? You ever wondered that kind of thing? Of course, it has nothing to do with God needing a rest and everything to do with him setting a precedent for us. He's leading by example. Here's the quote out of Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to your Lord God. On it you shall not do any work, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and then rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. That's in Exodus chapter 20. So the understanding is this: because God did it, you do it too. He did it first, so you, O human, can follow his lead. And the Old Testament reinforces this rule over and over and over again, right? It's written into the covenant. It's written into the Mosaic law. It's written into the 10 Commandments, for goodness sake. You work 6 days, and then you take the 7th off. So if that's the pattern, 6 days of work with 1 day off, which day of the week is the day off? Which day of the week is the Old Testament Sabbath? Do you know? It's Saturday. Right? See, the Hebrew reckoning of the calendar is that the week begins on Sunday. Sunday is day number 1. And then Saturday is the final day of the week. And so in the Old Testament understanding, you work on the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you take Saturday as your Sabbath, day of rest. And that command was comprehensive. That command for rest, comprehensive. Everybody was commanded to rest. If you are a fisherman, you rest. If you are a carpenter, you rest. If you're a farmer, you rest. If you're a warrior, you rest. If you're an artist, you rest. If you're an accountant, you rest. If you have an employee, they rest. If you have servants, they rest. If you have children or parents in your home, they also rest. If you have someone visiting from out of town who doesn't even follow these rules and regulations, you don't get to make them do the dishes on the Sabbath. No, they're in your home. They rest along with you. Exodus 20, again, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. And then it lists your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your livestock, or the foreigner who is the resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, but on the 7th day he rested. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. He made it holy. So vital was this commandment that the Hebrew people had many debates on what was and what was not considered work. In the Mishnah, do you know what the Mishnah is? The Mishnah is a set of writings they're not the Bible, but they are Hebrew rules. An extra set of rules, right? More strict rules, so that if you want to obey the commands of the Old Testament of the Bible, then what you do is you look at these volumes of Mishnah and obey those ones, and you're not going to get anywhere near the biblical rules, right? So they had this extra set of rules. Here's an example. The Bible is clear. You cannot thresh grain on the Sabbath. Okay. What is threshing grain? What does that mean? Okay, you're disturbing the grain, and what's that effectively do to the grain? Separate what? From what? Okay, separating the wheat from the chaff. We know what it is, right? It separates the undesirable outer part from the more desirable inner part, the grain. So by extrapolation, here's what the Pharisees and other law thinkers of the day did. They took that biblical principle, you shall not thresh, and they said, okay, well, it's this law about separating the bad from the good, and if that's the law, then we should make rules about you can't separate any of the bad from any of the good on any of the products that maybe you work with. It's not just about threshing grain, but it's a larger rule and larger principle, so therefore you cannot make fruit juice on the Sabbath. Why not? Because you're separating what from what? You're separating the pulp from the juice, right? And that's how their thinking goes. That's when they had debates about what are the definitions of work on the Sabbath. This is the kind of thing they thought about. They took a rule about threshing grain, and they turned it into a rule about you also cannot make juice on the Sabbath, because it's counted as work, and nobody is to do work on the Sabbath day, that day that God set aside. Did you know this in the Old Testament of the Bible? Even the fields get a Sabbath rest. Okay? Whole entire fields get a Sabbath rest. Here's the rule in Leviticus chapter 25. Straight out, this is a biblical rule. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, the land will observe a Sabbath to the Lord." The land will observe a Sabbath, not the people of the land. The land will observe a Sabbath to the Lord. You may sow your field. What's sowing the field? That's planting, right? Seeding. You may sow your field for 6 years, and you may prune your vineyard and gather its produce for 6 years, but there will be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land in the 7th year, a Sabbath to the Lord. You are not to sow your field or prune your vineyard. You are not to reap what grows by itself from your crop or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. It must be a year of complete rest for your land. Whatever the land produces during the Sabbath year can be food for you, for yourself, your male or female slave, and the hired hand and the foreigner who stays with you. All of its growth may serve as food for your livestock and the wild animals in your land. The deal was this, right? You had to leave the land alone on that 7th year. You cannot plow or plant or harvest. You are allowed to go through and pick what was there and consume it yourself for you and your own household. You were not allowed to harvest it to resell it to others. Okay? That was going too far. You have to work the land for 6 years and then leave it rest for the 7th. You see how complete and comprehensive this rule for Sabbath was in the Old Testament? 6 days everyone works, but on the 7th you rest. Sunday to Friday you work, Saturday you rest. But days off are not that easy to take, are they? If you're a manager, you know that the to-do list and the emergency calls, they do not hit pause just because you're out of the office, do they? If you own your own business, you're entirely aware that if you walk away for a day, close and lock that door, suddenly you're making no income. You got no cash flow that day. In my teens, I worked for a farmer, and I would sometimes get angry at the radio. Yes, your pastor has been known to lose his temper with inanimate objects. I admit that. What would happen is the weather report would come on. And it'd be July, and they'd say something like, over the next 3 days, it's going to be cloudy and rainy, high probability of thunderstorms. And then the reporter would say something like this, and this was my trigger. She'd say, well, that might ruin your plans for the cottage, but at least the farmers will be happy for the rain. Well, we did hay farming. It was not happy for us hay farming when it rained. Step 1 in hay farming is to take the hay vine and cut the whole field down into long rows, right? And step 2 is what? Wait. Wait for what? You got to wait for it to dry. You can't bale up wet hay and store it in your barn. You have to wait for it to dry. And all summer long, farming hay was this pattern of cutting a field and letting it dry and then baling up afterwards. And at any given time, you had a whole bunch of fields that might be down in their windrows. Do you know what kind of weather threw a monkey wrench into the whole works? Rain. Got it all wet all over again. And you'd have to stop and you'd have to wait till everything was dry. Rain was not our friend. And so when the weather was clear and the hay was dry, do you know what we did? We worked. We worked. Sun up till midnight, we'd go. We just go, go, go. The farmer I worked for never took a summer vacation because he had to get the work done when the days were clear and the weather was good. Imagine then the cost and the risk when each and every Sunday he did no work. Right? The sky could be blue, the sun shining, the hay perfectly dry in the fields, but we rested with cost and with risk. But there's cost and risk for anyone who takes a day off. Most people find that when you take a day off, you have extra work to do before you take the day, And when you get back, what do you find? Extra work to do when you get back, right? Ironically, it's a lot of effort to take a day off and to rest.
That's why a farmer won't take it off. Right?
Well, they typically don't take vacation in the summer because they can't afford. But the farmer I worked for, he took each and every Sunday off anyway, even though it would cost him, right? And taking a day off is made even all the more difficult in the modern era now because what? Why is it tougher now to take a day off? Email? Cell phones? Texting? It all follows you. It follows you wherever you are. It can invade whatever 24-hour period of time you're trying to take and kill any semblance of a Sabbath rest. It can follow you. But we cannot be surprised. That practice of a whole day off each week for a Sabbath was stubbornly countercultural even way back in the Old Testament biblical days. In fact, it makes no logical sense. It made no logical sense to them. Why skip a whole day of productivity? It's a great way to get behind in business. Compared to your competitors, just do 14% less work. And that's what one day in a week is, 14%. Still expect a decent profit margin, but take 14% more time off than your competitors. See how you do. And none of the other cultures surrounding the Hebrews had rules like this. Imagine doing business and trade with cultures who are 14% more available than you are. You're at a competitive disadvantage. There is and always has been cost and risk in obeying the Sabbath. But God asks it of his people anyway. Why? Well, first, God doesn't need a reason, right? He doesn't need a reason. He says, take a Sabbath rest, you take a Sabbath rest. God is to be respected and obeyed. But let's think about it a second. What kind of lesson is learned in a largely agrarian and hands-on society? You ever heard the expression, make hay while the sun shines? Right? These people, they lived and died by that rule, yet still they obeyed Sabbath keeping. What did it teach them? It taught them trust. Sabbath rest teaches you that you are not in control of your own destiny, that you can let go for an entire day and God will pick up the slack. If he commanded it, and if you do it, then the full and proper expectation is that he will be faithful to provide what you need. The Sabbath was about trust, and they kept it pretty well. But then something changed, right? This is the Old Testament part of the Bible. And then something changed. The person of Jesus Christ came along. What did he do that got people upset at him over Sabbath? He healed somebody. He healed a few somebodies on the Sabbath. And why were they upset about that? Isn't healing somebody good? Because it was good, or because it was work. And you shouldn't be doing work on the Sabbath. And so they got angry with him for that. What else did he or his followers do on the Sabbath one time? They plucked grain. So there they were. They were out for a walk. They were traveling from here to there, and they went through a field, and it was they were hungry, and so they grabbed some grain from the field. And what did they have to do? They smush it around, separating, eating, all that. They did work on the Sabbath. They were breaking the rules. It's interesting that Jesus himself never speaks against Sabbath law, nor does he break biblical Sabbath rules. What Jesus offends is only the extra hundreds of laws that the Pharisees invented quite outside of Scripture. Jesus never breaks the biblical command of Sabbath. he breaks the Pharisees' extra rules about Sabbath, right? And his point was simply this: it is never a breach of God's law to do good. Wasn't that his point? You are never breaking God's law if you do good. It's the Pharisees who created the rules that would prevent good from being done, but Jesus insists that works of compassion are entirely consistent with God's will, even if it's done on the Sabbath day of rest. So from those stories we conclude this: that Jesus did not throw Sabbath laws out the window. Rather, he simply insisted that works of compassion should never be prevented on the Sabbath. But then a significant thing happened that has redefined Sabbath. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, died on the cross and then rose again from the dead. And the days of the week when that happened are significant because it sets up a whole new pattern. He died on a Friday and he rose again on the Sunday. And suddenly the worship life of God's people changed. Because now worship was not centered around the day of rest, the Sabbath. Rather, worship was centered around the person of Jesus Christ. And for that reason, Sunday was chosen as the day of worship by the Christ-following community. Because it remembers the fullness of the power and the majesty of Jesus, who could defeat death. And if he could defeat death, he could defeat any sin that is keeping you away from right relationship with God. And very quickly, the early Christians began to change the pattern and relabel what they were doing. Rather than taking a day off for a Saturday Sabbath and do their worship of God in a synagogue, they began to worship in groups called ecclesia. It's a Greek word. And do you know what ecclesia means? Church. But it doesn't mean church in the sense that we understand it. It just simply means a gathering of people. So they were an ecclesia. They were a gathering of people. And they met on a Sunday to honor the resurrection of Jesus. And instead of calling it a Sabbath, they had a new name for it even. And they called it the Lord's Day. Okay. 1 Corinthians 16, 1-4. This is what Cindy read for us already. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up. The expectation for the community was that they were meeting on the first day every week. And that day is Sunday. And then in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, John talks about being in prayer on the Lord's Day. This is different. The Lord's Day is different than if you've heard the phrase from the Old Testament, the day of the Lord. Have you heard that phrase before? The day of the Lord is bad news, right? That's the judgment is coming term. The day of the Lord. Strong. It's powerful. There's judgment to come. The Lord's Day is the worship and celebration of Jesus' resurrection on the first day of the week. And so then through the years, Christians have done two things in response to these biblical ideas. The ideas of Sabbath and Lord's Day. Some Christians have attempted to keep them both. Some Christian traditions try to keep them both. Saturday is their Sabbath, their day of rest, and Sunday is the Lord's Day when they gather with other believers for worship. They try and do both. But that's really a small portion of the Christian community through history. If it's hard to take one day off each week, imagine trying to take off two for that purpose. Far more common and far more frequent as a Christian tradition is to wrap it all into one. Sunday then, for most Christian traditions, becomes the Lord's Day, in which we commemorate the phenomenal act of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and we relocate the restfulness of the Sabbath from Saturday and plug it into what we do and how we operate on Sunday the Lord's Day. And what I believe to be important here, what I think my responsibility to tell you about, is that God has indeed these two principles that He wants to be at work in your life. The two principles of rest and worship. And the two go hand in hand. Rest so that you do not believe that you are the primary driver of your life. If you become conceited, if you become arrogant, if you have an inflated sense of yourself such that you accept more responsibility than you can handle, then you will look at rest with disdain. You will think, I cannot afford to rest. I cannot afford that day. I have too much to do. If you are there in your heart, or actually in your behavior, on your calendar, in your day book, then you're kicking against God's own established rules for life. I think you need to reevaluate your priorities if you're too busy to rest. What's that? Yeah, your body can't take it. You need the rest. Hopefully, you come to that conclusion before your body starts breaking down, right? But I would prefer that you would even take the rest on principle of following God's order to do so, and not even waiting for all the secondary reasons to come into play. Or if you find that life is too busy, you have too many other things to do, such that you cannot possibly attend worship. Worship is a vital piece of the Christian life. But if you're too busy, if you got too much other stuff on your plate, you can't possibly do worship at the same time that's regularly scheduled through the week, that millions of other Christians participate on a regular basis and have done so through history. Then again, I think you need to rethink your priorities. The question you need to ask is, well, why do I worship? Why is it important? And why is it important for me to do it regularly and put that time aside? With these terms in our minds, rest and worship, I'm going to invite Mark and Betty back up to lead us in another song. And what I want you to do is I want you to consider, where are you in relation to God's command of weekly rest? Are you in a healthy place there, or have you let that get away from you? And where are you in God's command that you would worship? Where are you in your desire to worship because Jesus rose from the grave and you want to celebrate that week by week? Are you in a healthy place in relation to worship, or are you not? I want to offer that as we sing this next song together, if you want to have conversation with God about these things, then the prayer rails are open. You can make your way forward, you can kneel down, you can talk to God about that stuff. If you have to confess something, you can confess it to Him. If you need to reboot and restart, you can do that in His presence. But let us stand, and we'll participate in this next song together. And as we do, if you want to come forward...